Hi, welcome to another episode of Mutually Collaborate SME Insights, brought to you in partnership with Unleashing Leadership Potential and Old Mutual. I'm your host, Tsepo Mohotu, the CEO of Unleashing Leadership Potential. Today, we have a packed agenda that dives deep into the complexities of macroeconomic environment and its implications for SMEs. Whether you're a business owner or an aspiring entrepreneur, or simply interested in economic trends, this episode is designed to provide you with valuable insights and practical strategies. I'm really thrilled to announce today that I'll be joined by a very special guest, Johann Els, an expert in the macroeconomics with years of experience analyzing economic trends and their impact on business. Johann's insights will be invaluable as we navigate through our discussion points. Our discussion will be structured mainly into 4 categories. We'll start first with navigating, understanding the macroeconomic environment. Then we'll delve into navigating the economic policies. And then we'll look at building resilience against economic fluctuations. And lastly, we'll look at long-term strategic planning. Johann, welcome.
Thanks very much, Chip.
It's great to have you today in our podcast and really looking forward to an insightful discussion with you. So, Johann, maybe just before we delve deep into the discussion, do you mind just introducing yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Yes, I'm Old Mutual's chief economist. I've been into economics since I was in Standard 6 in 1976. Wow. I love the subject matter. It's a passion of mine to teach people how to understand all these complexities, how they fit together. And yeah, I've been with Old Mutual for a long time, delving into economics and what it means for investments and for the man in the street in terms of understanding inflation and interest rates and economic growth, etc.
So I think maybe just as a start, I mean, the SME space or the entrepreneurial space in South Africa, it's quite interesting. And we've seen quite a lot of people looking at it as an opportunity to really delve into, given the unemployment rate, the high unemployment rate that we have in the country, and poverty and all these different aspects that people find themselves in. How do you see entrepreneurship solving that gap of unemployment or economic state of our country?
Well, the SMEs are the big employers of this country. And we've seen a lot of people shifting out of working for formal companies and starting their own businesses in terms of doing better for themselves and employing more people. And of course, it depends on the economies. But I've seen lots of these trends in terms of a plumber, for instance, starting a plumbing business, employing a lot of people off the street. And that helps. Electricians, the same, but also the shops in the shopping centers. And we've seen this expanding quite rapidly. But also you need economic growth for all of these businesses to thrive, because if there's economic growth, then that will help all businesses. And sometimes SMEs struggle to get capital in terms of starting businesses, but once they're off the ground, there's huge need for the private individual to go and employ the services, whether it's plumbers or electricians or buying from these businesses in shopping centers. So it fulfills a huge need in the economy.
I think then with that, let's maybe start moving towards the topic of today, because these SMEs now find themselves having to work in conditions that they are not in control of. Yes. And I think that's what we want to look at today, to say that how can we help the SMEs to understand some of these concepts so that as they navigate in this particular space, they have got the necessary skill sets that they need and for them to navigate in this space. So maybe let's start with just some of the key terms in terms of macroeconomics that as SME needs to know and needs to be aware of.
Yeah, there's lots of unnecessary terminologies out there. GDP, for instance, yes. GDP growth, gross domestic product. That's simply just economic growth in the economy. Unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of that in South Africa in recent years. It's been too low, and that's why we've got huge social unrest problems, unemployment problems, and not enough profitability out there for SMEs. So economic growth is hugely important to understand. And we can delve later into policies to get that better going and get stronger economic growth. But there's also inflation. Inflation is a hugely important concept because that's what consumers feel at their pockets if prices are rising too fast. Sometimes prices are falling, and then it's difficult for SMEs to make a profit because they have to keep cutting prices to make sure consumers can buy these products. And then interest rates, of course. Interest rates depending on what the inflation levels are and some other factors like the rand exchange rate that influence potential inflation. If the rand weakens substantially and oil prices rise, you see petrol prices increase, that lifts inflation, and then the Reserve Bank, that's an independent institution, will have to raise interest rates to keep inflation under control. So all of these factors then inputting in terms of SMEs. For instance, if they've got debt or they want to borrow money from the bank, interest rates is a huge factor in terms of costs there. So lots of these economic variables, that's important to understand how they interact. A global economy could potentially have a big impact on the rand exchange rate. That's not dependent on us. We can't control that. And one of those factors is that the South African economy is a very small economy, but very open. In other words, lots of trade. So we're hugely dependent on what happens in the rest of the world. The US dollar, for instance, is the biggest driver of the rand exchange rate. Not really what we do here. And that, as I say, influences interest rates through inflation. And then many people are critical of the Reserve Bank. Why do you want to fight inflation? Well, high inflation is bad for the consumer. High inflation is enemy number one. I think Ronald Reagan, ex-US president, used to say, enemy number one is inflation. And that's true. That cuts into the wage growth of the ordinary man in the street. So it cuts into his ability to spend money. So that cuts into profitability of businesses.
Yeah. So then just maybe a follow-up question around that. Do you believe that the SME in South Africa understand this and how it impacts them directly in their businesses?
I think they do. I think they do. These are savvy people. They're entrepreneurs. And so I think they generally understand these issues, but I think there's perhaps opportunity to do more training and do more explaining from the experts in terms of how they can handle and navigate these conditions. Because sometimes in weak economic growth, you can still make money. You can still make a profit if you adjust your entrepreneurial potential into other areas of your business. Sometimes you have to cut costs. Sometimes, unfortunately, you can't employ that extra person or persons that you needed to employ so that your cost base is under control when it's a difficult circumstances. So it's not easy to navigate all these. And now that we also heading into elections, lots of uncertainty that might influence people's decision-making. I think we should stick to our plans. There's lots of noise around these areas, and we should not necessarily be led by too much noise and change our path forward too unnecessarily.
Okay, great stuff. So then how do we see all this, let's say specifically interest rates and inflation impact? I just want to break it down simply for an SME that might understand in simpler terms. How does then interest rates and inflation impact the cost of pricing strategies that they have in their businesses?
It's important to understand that inflation is an average for all consumers in this country. So your inflation number will be different to mine. So the headline number that we see published is an average of 63 million people's individual inflation rates. So that's very important to understand. So let's say you've got a business and they focused on, let's say it's a travel agent. And they focused on hotel costs, restaurant costs, and airline ticket costs. That's a very specific part of inflation. But you might have another business that's a dentist or a plumber, and there's very specific inputs in terms of those costs. It is not always easy to navigate that because it's this diverging trends within inflation. So you get inflation drives up. And it's not always easy to forecast. So inflation goes up, and the trend is then important. Reserve Bank starts hiking interest rates. So if you've got a lot of debt in your business, you have to pay more. Then you have to cut costs elsewhere, unfortunately. Fortunately, our Reserve Bank is a conservative institution. They realize the need to keep inflation low. But of course, inflation too low. The example of Japan, inflation in negative territory. That means the economy is really going backwards because there's no pricing power for these small businesses. They can't raise their prices. Very difficult. So in an economic growth environment, strong economic growth, of course, our entrepreneurs know that they can make more profits when the economy is growing strong because consumers have got more income to spend and the ability of them to raise their prices to make a higher profit margin becomes easier.
I see. So then maybe changing gears maybe into the next aspect around looking at the fiscal policies and monetary policies that currently impacting SME in South Africa. What are some of those that we could share to?
Yeah, and that's a great question because now we start to have to look forward because that's what's going to impact on businesses. The year now, not so much. If they want to plan for their business, we have to look forward. And inflation has been high and interest rates have been high. So there was a big pain in terms of the impact on businesses. But now looking forward, inflation is drifting lower. It's starting to come off. That means the Reserve Bank can start to cut rates. So if we look at the economic cycle going forward, lower inflation and lower interest rates, that should be good for businesses. Because the cost in terms of the interest payments on their debt goes down, big positive. Then from the fiscal side, we've been taxed a lot, businesses and consumers in this economy. Unfortunately, that's not going to go away quickly. It's unlikely that we'll be taxed more, it's unlikely tax rates will go up, but it is possible that tax rates will stay the same. So we're not going to get any relief from the fiscal policy side in terms of taxes. The other thing that they have to do on the fiscal side, they have to cut expenditure because the budget deficit is too big. It has been too big for too long. So the one area they can cut significantly is on public sector wage bill. That is 33% of total government expenditure. So that could be a potential negative for businesses down the line if the public sector workers don't get the normal big annual wage increases. So if
and then they can't spend.
Then they can't spend, and then it's bad for these SMEs. So that's a potential negative because if you think about it, 1/3 of all employment in South Africa is in the public sector. Now, if the public sector starts cutting back on wage increases or perhaps even not filling the empty posts in the public sector, that's a potential negative. But I think there's some policies in place that will drive economic growth. So better economic growth down the line could take away some of these negatives. The other area is that I think the rand exchange rate can strengthen significantly. So those SMMEs that import a lot of their product, the cost there will be lower as well. So lower import costs in terms of their product. Some of them will be able to pass that on to consumers. In other words, not increase their prices so much. Others might be able to lift their profit margin because lower input costs, but they don't cut their prices to the consumer. Profitability might be able to lift a little bit.
One aspect that sometimes bothers me around, when you look in South Africa, we are a country that consumes quite a lot, and our businesses and SMEs are geared towards us either just selling things and all this stuff, but less about us producing. And we then rely on imports and all that kind of stuff. Is there any some insights that you'd like to share? Maybe your point of view of what drives that in South Africa?
Yeah, that's partly due to labor. The perception out there, and I'm not expressing an opinion whether I believe that perception or not, but there's a perception that South African labor is too expensive, that they're not educated enough, and that unions have become too militant.
I see.
So that perception about labor in South Africa is a negative in terms of companies starting manufacturing businesses, processes where they have to employ more people, more workers. That's unfortunate, but it can gradually change if workers become more flexible in terms of accepting lower wages to start with and lower wage increases.
Minimum acceptable wage still.
Yes, but there's potential for manufacturing because we've seen AI, for instance. Lots of improvements in machinery and equipment, in the technologies available to produce stuff. So it might be easier to produce and cheaper to produce by using machinery and technologies and AI rather than employing more people. While that's negative for employment,
negative
it's not
employment,
great,
yeah,
but
yeah,
for
but
businesses
businesses,
focused on making a profit,
Yes,
it might be a great way.
So they don't have an excuse to say we should import. They could then use those technology to say, let's build more of these factories to produce this, because it's not really about labor anymore, but it's about using tech and what is available to you.
And those technologies have improved significantly. If you just look at the electricity, for instance, we now use 25% less ESCOM electricity to produce the same stuff, showing you that those machinery and equipment have become more efficient, running on less electricity. So more efficient means more profitability in terms of producing those products.
No, amazing. So, and I think maybe just closing back on that labor cost and all that, I would believe that we got a high rate of unemployment, meaning the universities are producing a whole lot of students that are trained. And I used to believe that the quality of education was really that poor, but when I check within the IT sector, which is an area that I'm interested in quite a lot, I see that we are producing skilled young people that are coming through universities, but yet they still sit unemployed at home, and then we still import this thing believing that we'll get it cheaper. I would believe that given that we've got so much skills in the country and people that are trained and universities are producing this, that should bring down the cost of labor per se, because
you're right. So there's a lot of output in terms of those skilled employment in many sectors, but there's also this lack of economic growth on the other side that don't produce enough opportunities for those skilled people. But we also need more skills. There's huge shortages in terms of engineers, in terms of financial people. So one of the big shortcomings in South Africa is on a municipal level, where there's failures of municipalities because they haven't got enough engineers or project managers. But you're right, in terms of IT and lots of those areas, financial area of the economy, big numbers of very highly skilled people are being produced.
Out of that. Okay, great. I hope within the actual operations and the manufacturing space, we could see a lot of the FETs and other produce more skilled people around that particular space, so that we can flood the market with those skill sets, and at the same time we reduce the cost of labor, but also flood the markets with skills that are required to really transform and change our country to start building factories, man.
That's true, but the economy has also shifted significantly from manufacturing factories much more into services, the IT stuff, the financial services. So in South Africa, the big growth area potentially is tourism. So we're viewed by foreign tourists as a cheap destination, beautiful destination, fantastic services in our hotels and restaurants, and that will bring more and more tourists down the line. So that's a big growth area, and we can see that in terms of little small businesses opening up on the tourism side of the economy.
Okay, great. So with this notion of we a country rich with raw material, I mean, everybody keeps saying this, Africa is rich in raw material and it's rich with all these minerals and all this stuff, yet we still export and then buy it back. Maybe last comment on that. I know it's a discussion that has been held all over the place. So what's your view around that still, to really solve this whole thing of making sure that we increase manufacturing and all this stuff, given that we've got all these raw materials in there?
Yes, absolutely. So we perhaps need more entrepreneurs, more people willing to take a chance and jump into that area. But perhaps we need a reform of our labor, deregulate the labor market more. In other words, make it easier for businesses to hire people in difficult times for small business. Make it easier for him to fire those people as well. It sounds bad, but when a business is under pressure because of costs of less profitability, the cost base must be reduced. And a big part of a cost base in any business is labor. But our labor system is too regulated. So if you deregulate more, you'll have the opportunity to grow the manufacturing sector more. And perhaps government can reduce some of the red tape around the businesses. I believe, and while the president has mentioned this many times, there's still a lot of red tape around. We should make it as cheap as possible and as easy as possible to start and run a business. And it's not yet. There's lots of regulation that we need to do and jump through before we can start a business. So red tape is still a big negative issue.
So while we need to deal with the entrepreneurial mindset, then we need to look at some of the environment where entrepreneurs need to work on. I think that's where you're saying government needs to come in. But I think on the overall entrepreneurial mindset, it's something that we really need to push hard on, so that who then is going to come with those ideas to say, how do we convert these minerals and take them and produce something that can be used to better our economy? I think it's a very interesting area that we need to look at, probably made in partnerships with between public and private sector. Absolutely. And the education system, specifically universities and all that, to produce more young people that have entrepreneurial mindset rather than waiting to be employed.
Absolutely. There's a big area here that we can go into, the private sector's role in the economy and economic policy, because behind all this, in my opinion, still sits weak economic growth. And I think the outlook is improving, and the private sector will play a big role in producing more economic growth.
So maybe back to the overall policies, and so if I'm a small entrepreneur and really starting up, are there specific trends that I can watch? Because I can believe that the changes that leads to the policies that needs to change takes a little bit of time. What is it that I watch for, and what are some of those trends that I need to look out for me to be able to position myself correctly?
That's an important question, because I think we've become totally disillusioned in South Africa. We think this lack of economic growth, this stagnation, is just going to continue going forward. But government has instituted a lot of these policies where they allow the private sector a bigger role in the economy. And while it might not be immediately evident that the small businesses can take part, they can. The biggest area, of course, is energy, where Eskom has failed. So where government and state-owned enterprises have failed, the private sector has taken up that role. As an aside, in my opinion, this allowing the private sector to generate as much electricity as they want to in the economy is, apart from the shift from apartheid to a democratic society, the biggest policy change ever in South Africa. So now we're going to have electricity going forward. But there's huge potential for businesses to get involved there in terms of solar panels, producing it here, in terms of the cabling needed, in terms of installation. There's lots of the private small businesses that gets involved in that area. I live in Stellenbosch, and I've seen the number of houses around me who's got small businesses that install the solar panels. There's been a boom in terms of that. That's a new area. In terms of logistics as well, think about the big stories, of course, Checker 6060 and all the delivery partners. But that's a lot of small businesses that run a couple of delivery drivers that works for 6060. So the small business environment getting involved in new areas of the economy. So the policies has been in the right direction, and this private sector involvement will lift economic growth. And economic growth is important because that's what will drive turnover in these small businesses. You need stronger economic growth that'll produce more jobs, that'll produce more income for consumers, which they have to spend or want to spend, and thereby you drive turnover growth and profitability in small businesses. So it's important for small businesses to keep an eye on these policy changes, because you mentioned public-private partnerships. There's more and more and more of those coming on.
So we need to be a little bit more optimistic.
Yes, and take opportunities, take a chance within those environments.
And if you fail, you start again.
You start again. That's what we do as South Africans, eh? We're resilient.
Resilient. Okay, great. That leads me to the next question in terms of, and you touched a little bit on it, but maybe I'd like you to comment more around how can SME adopt innovation to really stay competitive during these economic environments that are downturning upwards. Yeah,
that's not so easy for me to answer, but mentally, from an economist perspective, I think you have to keep abreast of all new developments. Read up, make sure that, for instance, if you're in a renewable energy environment, or if you're in a plumbing environment, keep abreast of new ideas. Google new opportunities and take that chance if you see an opening out there. And keep up with education, keep up training yourself. If you feel you've got a shortcoming, train yourself, ask the experts. That's always important. Never be afraid to acknowledge that you don't know everything. I don't know everything. You don't know everything.
Definitely.
We learn each day. And that's the way we keep our entrepreneurial capabilities top notch.
No, that's very true. I think with the university students that are trained, some of them in these spaces, I think for me, I think SMEs can really gain a lot of insights by just bringing them, give them an opportunity, let them come look at what innovative ways can they help those organizations, give them the opportunity to come practice their skill sets that they've gained. And in that way, you might not have those skill sets, but allowing them to come into that space, they could come back with lots of ideas and a lot of stuff that can help small SMEs. I think for me, there's an area that I feel SMEs should start looking into, partner maybe with the universities and say, hey, I'm an SME and I'm doing this and this. Do you have students maybe that are in that innovation space that can come and help look at my business and give me some?
I totally agree. We run competitions for economic students, and while it's different, the young people, the students have got fantastic ideas. They might not always work out, but the young millennials, they've got great entrepreneurial ideas.
Great. Earlier you spoke about how we as South Africa are a resilient country. And I wanted you maybe to share something around how has SMEs successfully adapted to challenging economic conditions. If we go back to COVID-19 and we saw things turning and things becoming so bad and all this stuff, how do you think South African SMEs have managed to adapt to those challenges?
I think again, through the need to survive. Just the need to survive. In Stellenbosch, where I live, I know quite a few of those restaurants that in lockdown they had to close. They immediately switched their operations to be able to deliver food. So instead of producing nice meals on a plated meals, they produced the somewhat different meals like, let's say, lasagnas and stuff that you can package differently, and immediately started sending that out through orders. And there's lots of those kind of examples. That resilience. But it's basic human need. I know I have to survive, so I think about something else. How can I change my business to do it somewhat differently? And I think that is what is behind all of us as human beings. The need to survive, the need to have that income, the need to provide for our families. That brings forth new ideas.
Great stuff. In this podcast section that we have, we always like our guests to give a message of hope, probably to our viewers, specifically in this particular segment, the SMEs. So what are some of the parting words that you want to leave with our viewers, and some message of hope that you can give to
Absolutely.
people?
Thank you for that question, because I believe there's so much noise around in the news. The National Bureau of Economic Research in the US has done a study over 200 years, billions of articles. The media has become far more sensationalist in order to sell their product. Especially with new electronic media coming on, newspapers had to become far more negative. So the news that we read every day, it's only the negative stuff. Yeah. That's lots of noise. I want us to delve through that and see that there are positives coming through. And while it's not great, it's sometimes slow in being implemented, policies from government, but this role of the private sector, and that's going to create lots of opportunities, but it's also going to lift economic growth. And that's important to take into account, that from 1% economic growth that was virtually nothing, we can go towards 2.5% growth. And that's more than double. Think about the profitability. Think about the turnover potential. Think about people moving into cities. Think about tourism potential. And I believe, don't focus on the negatives. If you only focus on the negatives, the potholes, the politics, the indecision, you're not going to take those opportunities. You're going to miss out on opportunities. It's not all rosy. It's going to be a slow process, but we've bottomed in terms of the economy and we're heading upwards. That's going to create significant opportunities. And that is what I want the small businesses to take part in, this process to more private sector involvement in the economy.
Johann, thank you very much. That was really insightful. I really enjoyed the discussion, specifically the practical examples that you've given in terms of how SMEs can really leverage in this particular space. So really thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Our viewers, thank you very much. This was really a powerful, insightful episode this month, and we really like you to stay tuned and get engaged with us. Chat to us, send us more questions, and then we can then respond and get our guests to even respond offline as we continue having this discussion in this particular space. I hope you got what you need to navigate this particular economic environment. And with that, thank you and God bless.